Children of the 1970s, having inherited a reflexive cynicism towards authority without a cause greater than recycling or a sacrifice more painful than gas lines, learned early on to feel envy, shame, and resentment. The last thing anyone growing up in the 70s imagined was that a great historical transformation was occurring. But 70s teenagers became academics and journalists, and inevitably, a small historical literature of the decade has begun to accumulate. It turns out that the 70s gave birth to the America in which we now live. The 1970s in America was a volatile and revolutionary time, characterized by both bold fashion statements and bold political ones. At the head of the raw, racially, and politically charged society was the Black Power movement, characterized by beliefs in black pride and self-sufficiency. Although not as often recognized as such, the trial of prominent activist Angela Davis was one of the most important turning points in this movement and in American history, by both bringing international attention to the issues that activists like Davis fought for and forcing the American people to face a hard truth about race relations for their generation and going forward. Davis's unique upbringing was formative for her later years in the public eye. Born in 1944 in Birmingham, Alabama, Davis came of age during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, in the epicenter of the conflict. Her childhood was steeped in violence and spotted with conflict. Angela Davis, an autobiography published in 1975, produces a detailed description of important turning points that impacted her emotionally. Verbal abuses, explosions, and dirty looks were typical of the environment she grew up in. Because of the experiences of her childhood, she began to develop, quote, an ambivalent attitude toward the white world. She says, in a remark on the early years of her adolescence, on the one hand, there was our instinctive aversion towards those who prevented us from realizing our grandest as well as our most trivial wishes. On the other, there was the equally instinctive jealousy, which came from knowing they had access to all the pleasurable things we wanted. And yet, I have a very vivid recollection of deciding, very early, that I would never harbor or express the desire to be white. This ambivalence was further underscored by her moving to New York City in her junior year to attend Elizabeth Irwin High School. Here she was exposed to a new liberal community, in stark contrast to the traditional, predominantly black environment she grew up in. The progressiveness of this education during the determinative years of her upbringing was a good transition to her higher education and activism that followed. In New York and in her following 4 years at Brandeis University, she got involved with the Communist Party and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Her involvement with these groups helped her develop her political views and vision of the world. Davis came into the public realm at the time the equal rights movement was making a critical change. Around 1968, many young blacks rejected the patience that characterized the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and public sentiment began to shift from a nonviolent movement based on peaceful civil disobedience to one that was based on the protection and prosperity of black communities. Influenced by the words of Malcolm X, the new Black Power movement justified the use of violence in the accomplishment of black protection, justice, and equality, something that distinguished themselves greatly from their predecessors.
Well, during that period, both SNCC and the Black Panther Party were responsible for ushering the black movement into a new era, I think, and it was especially the role that Huey and Bobby and others played in establishing a new stance, a stance of resistance. And all of us, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of young black people across this country were affected by that new militant stance that was assumed by the brothers and the sisters who went in the community and who said, we will no longer allow the police to brutalize us. We will stand up with dignity.
Davis, following her move to California, first for graduate school at the University of California, San Diego, and then for associate professor work at UCLA, solidified her own version of the ideals of the movements she identified with. In a 1989 interview, she explains why she initially took on communism as her own cause. I joined the Communist Party because I had come into contact with a number of communists, black communists in particular, in working with SNCC and doing community work in San Diego and Los Angeles. I was always very impressed by their vision, which seemed to go much further than what was happening at the moment. which seemed to be much broader than specifically the issues confronting black people at that particular moment in history. They had a long-range vision. They also had a sense of how to involve other progressive people, and I associated myself in general with their vision.